Ambassador Helena Vance stood alone in the crystalline halls of the Galactic Concord and felt the weight of human history pressing down on his shoulders like a mountain of stone and sorrow and broken dreams. The hall stretched before her in impossible beauty, with walls of living crystal that sang soft harmonies and floors of polished starstone that reflected the light of 1,000 distant suns. But Helena could not appreciate any of it because she carried the burden of defeat in her heart. 3 colony worlds had burned in the war against the Velthari Dominion, and millions of human souls had perished in fire and vacuum and the cold darkness between stars, and Earth's mighty fleet now existed only as scattered debris floating above Neptune, where the final battle had torn humanity's pride into fragments of twisted metal and frozen corpses. The Velthari had won, and now Helena had to accept the terms of surrender. High Commander Zorath waited at the treaty table, and his 6 gleaming eyes studied Helena with the cold curiosity of a scientist examining an insect beneath a lens, and his mandibles clicked together in a sound that Helena had learned to recognize as satisfaction among his species. The Velthari were ancient beings who had evolved on a low-gravity world of vast crystal forests, and they stood 7 feet tall on 4 spindly legs, with 2 additional limbs that served as arms, and their exoskeletons shimmered with colors that shifted like oil on water. And they had conquered 12 star systems through technology and patience, and the absolute certainty that they were superior to all other forms of life. You have read the terms, Zorath said, and his voice emerged from a translation device around his throat in flat mechanical tones that carried no emotion. Helena nodded and kept her face carefully blank, even though rage and grief burned in her chest like hot coals. Humanity will cede all territorial claims in the Kepler systems, she recited in a voice that did not waver, even though her hands wanted to shake with fury. And humanity will pay reparations in rare minerals for a period of 100 standard years, and humanity will agree to complete disarmament of all advanced weapons in the neutral zone of Tethys 4. Correct, Zorath replied, and his mandibles clicked again with that terrible satisfaction. And you understand what advanced weapons means according to our definition. Helena understood perfectly because the Velthari had been very precise in their language, and that precision had been designed to strip humanity of every possible means of resistance. The treaty defined advanced weapons as any device that utilized combustion propellants or electromagnetic acceleration or nuclear reactions or fusion reactions or guided targeting systems or energy discharge mechanisms, and this definition covered everything from simple gunpowder rifles to the massive plasma cannons that had failed to save humanity's fleet. Your projectile weapons are forbidden, Zorath continued, and he seemed to take pleasure in listing each item. And your plasma cannons are forbidden, and your railguns are forbidden, and your guided missiles are forbidden, and your explosives are forbidden, and your energy weapons are forbidden, and surveillance satellites will monitor the neutral zone at all times, and any violation of these terms will result in immediate and total annihilation of your remaining colonies. Helena felt the words strike her like physical blows. But she did not flinch because she was a diplomat and her people needed her to be strong even in this moment of absolute defeat. And in exchange, she said carefully, the Velthari Dominion will cease all hostile actions against human territories and will allow the colony on Tethys 4 to continue under joint administration for a transition period of 2 standard years, Zorath agreed, after which the neutral zone will come under full Velthari control and the human colonists will be relocated to whatever world your species still possesses. 200,000 people lived on Tethys 4, and they had built homes there and raised children there and planted gardens in the alien soil, and now they would be forced to abandon everything they had created and start over again on some distant rock while the Velthari claimed their world as a trophy of conquest. Helena wanted to scream, and she wanted to throw the treaty in Zorath's face, and she wanted to tell him that humanity would never surrender. But she could not do any of those things, because her people had already lost, and more defiance would only bring more death. So she picked up the ceremonial stylus, and she pressed it to the document, and she signed her name in letters that seemed to burn with shame, and she felt something break. Inside her heart, as she did it, Zorath signed his own name in the flowing script of his species, and his mandibles spread wide in what might have been a smile among his kind. "Your species fought well," he said, and the words were clearly meant as condescension rather than compliment. "But you must understand that this outcome was inevitable from the beginning, and the Velthari have been waging war among the stars for longer than your species has existed, and we have seen 100 civilizations rise and fall, and none of them have ever defeated us." Helena said nothing because there was nothing to say, and she simply gathered the treaty documents and turned to leave the hall, and she walked with her back straight and her head high, because even in defeat, a human being could maintain dignity. But as she walked away, she thought about the colonists on Tethys 4, and she thought about the Velthari peacekeeping forces that would soon be stationed among them, and she thought about what it would mean for her people to live under alien occupation for 2 long years. And she thought about something else as well. She thought about how the Velthari had evolved on a peaceful world, where physical conflict was rare, and she thought about how they had conquered their enemies through superior technology rather than superior will, and she thought about how they had never faced an enemy who had nothing left to lose. The Velthari believed they understood war because they had won many wars, but Helena knew something that Zorath did not know, and it was this simple truth that kept her walking forward even as despair clawed at her heart. The Velthari had banned advanced weapons, because advanced weapons were the only weapons they understood, and they had never bothered to study human history, and they did not know that humanity had been killing each other with terrible efficiency for thousands of years before the first gun was ever invented. They did not know about the longbow and the crossbow and the catapult and the trebuchet and the Greek fire and the countless other instruments of death that humans had created in the Dark Ages before technology, and they did not know that these weapons had never been banned by the treaty, because the treaty only mentioned advanced weapons, and Helena thought that perhaps this war was not over after all. Perhaps it was only beginning. General Marcus Chun stood in a bunker beneath the city of New Helsinki on Tethys 4 and looked at the faces of his officers and saw the same anger and frustration that burned in his own heart reflected back at him like flames in a mirror. The bunker had been a mining facility before the war, and its walls were rough stone and its ceiling dripped with moisture, and the air smelled of earth and iron and the sweat of desperate people planning desperate things. 6 months had passed since Ambassador Vance had signed the treaty, and the Velthari peacekeeping force had grown bolder with each passing week, and they seized supplies from the colonists, and they enforced brutal curfews, and they made people disappear in the night for crimes that were never explained. Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka slammed her fist against the table, and her voice cracked with frustration as she spoke. "We cannot use anything," she said bitterly, "and they have confiscated every firearm and every explosive and every weapon we possessed, and they have scanners at every checkpoint that can detect even a single bullet hidden in a pocket, and we are completely helpless." The other officers nodded in grim agreement, and their eyes were hollow with defeat, and their shoulders slumped with the weight of occupation. But General Chun did not nod, and he did not agree, and instead he smiled a thin, cold smile that made the others look at him with confusion and concern. "They have confiscated every advanced weapon," Chun said carefully, and he emphasized the word advanced in a way that made it sound like a door swinging open. "But the treaty only bans advanced weapons, and the treaty is very specific about what that term means." He activated a holographic display in the center of the table, and the officers leaned forward, expecting to see schematics for some secret weapon that had escaped the Velthari scanners, but what they saw instead made them stare in disbelief. The hologram showed a longbow, not a plasma rifle or a railgun or any other marvel of human engineering, but a simple curved piece of wood with a string stretched between its ends and an arrow resting against the string ready to fly, sir. Lieutenant Tanaka said slowly, as if she thought the general might have lost his mind. That is a bow and arrow. Yes, it is, Chun replied, and his smile grew wider. And I want everyone in this room to study these designs very carefully, because this is how we are going to win our freedom. He cycled through more images, and the hologram showed crossbows with powerful limbs and precision triggers, and it showed trebuchets with massive counterweights, capable of hurling stones the size of a human head, and it showed siege towers and battering rams and weapons that humans had used to kill each other for thousands of years. Before gunpowder changed everything, the treaty bans combustion and electromagnetic acceleration and guided systems, and energy weapons. Chun explained, and his voice grew hard with determination. But it says nothing about tension power projectiles, and it says nothing about counterweight siege engines, and it says nothing about incendiary compounds made from naturally occurring materials. Dr. Priya Sharma was the colony's chief engineer, and she had been listening with growing understanding, and now she leaned forward with excitement blazing in her dark eyes. Greek fire, she said, and the words came out like a prayer. We can make Greek fire from pine resin and sulfur and rendered animal fat, and it burns underwater and cannot be smothered, and it is not covered by the treaty because it does not use combustion propellants in the modern sense. Chan nodded and pointed at her with approval. The Velthari evolved on a low-gravity world, he continued, and their exoskeletons are brittle, and they have never faced an enemy who wanted to get close because all of their wars have been fought with energy weapons at great distances, and their personal shields are calibrated to stop high-velocity impacts because that is the only kind of attack they have ever known. Lieutenant Tanaka was beginning to understand, and her eyes widened as the implications became clear. A slow-moving arrow, she said with wonder in her voice, might pass right through their shields, because the shields are not designed to stop something traveling at only 300 feet per second. Exactly, Chun confirmed, and their armor is designed to disperse energy weapons and stop hypersonic rounds, but against a broadhead arrow or a crossbow bolt with a bodkin point, it would be like wearing a mesh shirt to stop a knife. The officers looked at each other, and something changed in their faces, and the defeat that had weighed them down began to lift like fog burning away in morning sunlight. We have 6 months until the transition period ends, Chun said, and his voice rang with command. And when that deadline arrives, the Velthari expect to take full control of our colony and relocate our people to some distant rock where we will live as refugees and beggars. He stood straight and tall, and his eyes burned with fierce determination. That is not going to happen, he declared. And instead, we are going to teach these aliens a lesson that their species will remember for 1,000 generations, and we are going to show them what happens when you try to disarm humanity. He looked at each of his officers in turn, and he saw the fire returning to their eyes, and he knew that they were ready to fight. I want every able-bodied colonist trained, he ordered, and I want archers and crossbowmen and siege engineers and blacksmiths, and I want people who can move silently through the darkness and strike without warning and disappear before the enemy knows what hit them. Dr. Sharma was already making notes on her tablet, and her mind was racing with possibilities. I can manufacture crossbow bolts by the thousands, she said eagerly, and we have tungsten in the mines that we can shape into broadheads and bodkin points, and we have carbon fiber that we can use for arrow shafts, and we have everything we need to build trebuchets and catapults from local materials. Good, Chun said with satisfaction, and I want training to begin immediately, and I want it done in secret in the abandoned mine tunnels where the Velthari scanners cannot reach. Lieutenant Tanaka raised her hand with a question. Sir, she asked. What? about the Velthari reaction when they realize what we are doing, and surely they will update the treaty to ban these weapons as well. Chen laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound. The Galactic Concord requires mutual consent for treaty amendments, he explained, and we are going to refuse every request for negotiation, and by the time the Velthari realize their mistake, it will be far too late. He looked at the holographic display one last time, and he saw the ancient weapons of his ancestors, glowing in the dim light of the bunker, and he felt a connection to every human who had ever picked up a weapon to defend their home and their family and their freedom. We are going back 2,000 years. General Chun said softly, to win a war 10,000 years in the future, and the Velthari think they have stripped us of our power, but they are about to learn the truth. He clenched his fist and raised it high. Humanity's greatest weapon has never been our technology, he declared, and it has always been our refusal to accept defeat. The officers rose to their feet and raised their own fists, and in that moment the resistance was born. Sub-Prefect Kythos stood in the center of Outpost Gamma and watched the human colonists shuffle past with their heads bowed and their spirits broken, and he felt a deep satisfaction warming his carapace like sunlight on a pleasant afternoon. The Outpost was a small farming settlement on the edge of the wilderness, and it held perhaps 500 humans who grew crops in the alien soil and raised animals for food and lived their small, meaningless lives under the watchful eyes of the Velthari. Occupation Force. Kythos commanded 30 soldiers at this outpost, and each of them carried a pulse rifle capable of reducing a human to ash in a fraction of a second, and each of them wore personal shield generators that could stop any projectile known to galactic civilization, and Kythos considered his posting here to be an insult to his abilities. These humans were pathetic creatures, and they had been completely disarmed, and they posed no threat whatsoever, and Kythos dreamed of requesting a transfer to somewhere more exciting where he could earn glory and promotion instead of babysitting primitives. He turned to his second-in-command and clicked his mandibles with irritation. Have the humans delivered the food tribute for this week? He demanded, and I want a full accounting of their livestock and grain stores. His second-in-command consulted a data tablet and began to reply, but he never finished his sentence. The arrow came from the tree line like a whisper of death, and it made no sound as it flew through the evening air, and Kythos did not even see it until it was already too late. His personal shield flickered briefly as the projectile passed through it, and the shield had been calibrated to stop objects traveling above the speed of sound, but this arrow was moving at barely 300 feet per second, and the shield's sensors did not even register it as a threat. The tungsten broadhead punched through Kythos' ceremonial carapace like was made of paper, and the force of the impact lifted him off his feet and threw him backward, and the arrow pinned him to the supply crate behind him, and he had just enough time to feel surprise before the darkness took him. For a moment, nobody moved and nobody understood what had happened, and the Velthari soldiers stared at their commander's body with confusion and shock. Then the second volley came. A dozen arrows flew from the forest in perfect silence, and each one found a target, and Velthari soldiers fell with shafts of carbon fiber protruding from their bodies, and their shields flickered uselessly against weapons that moved too slowly to trigger their defenses. Contact. Someone screamed. We are under attack. The remaining soldiers raised their pulse rifles and began firing into the tree line, and the energy bolts lit up the gathering darkness like lightning, and they tore through branches and vaporized leaves and scorched the earth, but the humans were already gone. They had loosed their arrows and melted back into the wilderness like ghosts, and they left nothing behind but dead Velthari and terror, and the certain knowledge that the war had changed forever. News of the attack at Outpost Gamma spread through the Velthari command structure like fire through dry grass, and within hours, every garrison on Tethys 4 was on high alert. High Commander Zorith received the report on his flagship in orbit. and he read the details with growing disbelief, and his mandibles trembled with emotions that he could not name. They used sticks and strings. He said slowly, as if the words themselves were impossible. And they killed 12 of our soldiers with pointed sticks launched by strings. His tactical advisor shifted uncomfortably, and his carapace flushed with colors that indicated shame and confusion. The weapons do not violate the treaty, the advisor explained reluctantly, and our legal experts have reviewed the definitions, and these primitive devices are technically compliant with all terms. Zorath slammed his forelimbs against his command throne, and the sound echoed through the bridge like a thunderclap. Then update the treaty, he demanded, and ban these primitive weapons immediately. We cannot, High Commander, the advisor replied with even more discomfort, because the Galactic Concord requires mutual consent for treaty amendments, and the human ambassador has already refused to negotiate. Zorath felt something cold crawling through his body, and it took him a moment to recognize it as fear. His species had conquered 12 star systems, and they had never lost a war, and they had never faced an enemy willing to fight at close range with primitive weapons, because such tactics were unthinkable to any civilized species. But these humans were not civilized. They were something far more dangerous. Over the following weeks, the attacks continued, and they grew bolder and more devastating. With each passing day, Velthury patrols disappeared in the wilderness, and search parties found their bodies pierced with arrows and their equipment destroyed, and sometimes the soldiers were not killed, but left wounded and screaming so that their cries would lure their comrades into ambushes. Supply convoys were hit by weapons that the Velthury had never seen before, and massive stones flew through the air in high arcing trajectories and crashed into vehicles with devastating force, and the Velthury engineers could not understand how the humans were launching these projectiles without any energy signature or propellant explosion. The answer was the trebuchet, and it was a weapon so ancient that no galactic database even contained records of its existence. And then came the fire. The humans called it tethys. Fire, and it was a mixture of pine resin and sulfur and rendered animal fat that burned with terrible intensity and could not be extinguished with water and could not be smothered with sand, and it clung to Velthury carapaces and burned through them like acid. A garrison at the northern settlement woke to find their barracks engulfed in flames that seemed to come from nowhere, and soldiers ran screaming into the night with fire crawling over their bodies, and nothing they did could stop the burning. The Velthury began to fear the darkness. They began to fear the forests and the hills, and any place where humans might be hiding with their bows and their arrows and their impossible primitive weapons. And in the bunkers beneath New Helsinki, General Chun received reports of each successful attack, and he smiled grimly and marked another victory on his tactical map. They are beginning to understand, he told his officers, and soon they will understand completely. Lieutenant Tanaka looked at the map with its spreading marks of human resistance, and she asked the question that was on everyone's mind. What happens when they decide to stop playing by the rules? She asked. And what happens when they bring their full military force against us? Chun nodded, because he had been expecting this question. That is exactly what we want them to do, he replied, because when they commit their forces to crushing US, they will discover that humans have been fighting siege warfare for thousands of years, and we have learned lessons that they cannot imagine. He pointed to New Helsinki on the map, and his eyes gleamed with fierce determination. Let them come, General Chun said softly, and let them learn what happens when you corner a species that refuses to die. The Velthury army approached New Helsinki like a tide of gleaming carapaces and flashing weapons, and Field Commander Vorthus watched from his command vehicle with absolute confidence that this day would see the end of human resistance forever. 5,000 soldiers marched in perfect formation, and their pulse rifles hummed with deadly energy, and their personal shields shimmered in the morning light, and behind them came armored vehicles bristling with weapons that could level a city block. In seconds above them flew surveillance drones that scanned every inch of the landscape with sensors, capable of detecting a heartbeat from 1,000 meters away. And attack craft circled in lazy patterns, waiting for the order to unleash devastation. Verthas had been given a simple mission by High Commander Zorth, and that mission was to crush the human rebellion completely and utterly, and to make an example that would discourage any future resistance. He looked at the walls of New Helsinki, and he clicked his mandibles in amusement. The humans had built walls around their city, and the walls were made of local stone, reinforced with some kind of fiber material, and they rose perhaps 10 meters high with towers at regular intervals, and Vorthas thought they looked like something from a primitive history archive. How quaint, he said to his tactical officer. And the humans have built themselves a castle as if stones and mortar could stop a modern army. His officer consulted his sensors and frowned with slight concern. Commander, he reported, I am detecting approximately 300 humans positioned on the walls, and they appear to be carrying the primitive weapons that have been used in previous attacks. Vorthas waved a forelimb dismissively. 300 primitives with sticks against 5,000 of our finest soldiers. He scoffed. And this will be over before midday, and we will celebrate our victory with fresh supplies from their stores. He gave the order to advance, and the Valkyrie army surged forward across the open ground that separated them from the city. Wall's General Chun stood on the highest tower of New Helsinki and watched the enemy approach, and he felt a strange calm settling over him like a familiar blanket. Had trained for this moment, and his people had trained for this moment, and they had studied the ancient arts of war that humanity had practiced for millennia before the first starship ever left Earth. Archers ready, he called out, and his voice carried along the walls through a network of speaking tubes that required no electronics and could not be jammed. 300 longbowmen raised their weapons and knocked their first arrows, and the bows were powerful things with draw weights of over 100 pounds, and the men and women who wielded them had trained for months to build the strength and skill required. Wait for my command, Chun ordered, and he watched the Valkyrie formation march closer and closer, and he calculated distances with the practiced eye of a hunter who understood that patience was the greatest weapon of all. The Valkyrie reached the optimal range, and Chun raised his arm and held it there for 1 heartbeat, and then 2, and then 3. Loose, he roared, and his arms swept down. 300 arrows flew into the sky, and for a moment they seemed to hang there against the clouds like a flock of deadly birds, and then they fell. The Valkyrie shields flickered and failed because they had not been designed for this, and the arrows punched through armor that had been built to stop energy weapons, and soldiers fell in windrows like wheat before a scythe. Reload, Chun commanded, and loose at will. The longbowmen could fire 10 arrows per minute, and they had trained until their arms ached and their fingers bled. And now that training paid off as a continuous rain of death fell upon the Valkyrie army. 1,000 arrows every minute fell upon the invaders, and the shields could not stop them, and the armor could not stop them, and soldiers died by the dozens, and then by the hundreds. Field Commander Vorthas stared in disbelief as his perfect formation dissolved into chaos and screaming and death. Advance the vehicles, he screamed into his communicator, and break down those walls. The armored transports rolled forward with their weapons charging, and their crews confident that nothing could stop them, and they were wrong. The trebuchets had been built in secret, and they were massive things with counterweights of stone and iron that could hurl 50-kilogram projectiles in high arcing trajectories, and when they spoke, the sound was like thunder boulders the size of human torsos flew over the walls and crashed into the armored vehicles with devastating force, and the vehicles had been designed to resist energy weapons and explosive charges, but they had not been designed to resist raw kinetic energy delivered by tons of falling stone transports. Crumpled like tin cans, and their crews died screaming and the advance ground to a halt as more and more stones rained down from the sky. Vorthas ordered his attack craft to destroy the trebuchets. But the humans had anticipated this, and they had built their siege engines in sheltered positions behind the walls where the aircraft could not target them without flying directly over the city and into range of the crossbowmen, who waited with heavy weapons designed specifically for this purpose. Aircraft fell burning from the sky before the others retreated to a safe distance. The assault continued for hours, and the Valkyrie threw everything they had against the walls of New Helsinki, and nothing worked. When they tried to establish forward positions, the humans launched clay pots filled with Tethys fire from smaller catapults, and the burning compound spread across the ground and created walls of flame that could not be crossed. When they tried to approach at night, they discovered that the humans had seeded the ground with sharpened stakes hidden beneath thin layers of soil, and soldiers screamed as the stakes pierced their leg joints and left them helpless. When they sent scouts to find weaknesses in the defenses, the scouts simply vanished, and their bodies were found days later with crossbow bolts in their backs. Siege lasted 3 months, and each day brought new horrors for the Valkyrie army. Humans emerged from hidden tunnels at night and crept through the darkness with swords and knives, and they killed sentries and destroyed supplies and disappeared before anyone could respond. And the Valkyrie thermal sensors and motion detectors were useless because they had been calibrated for modern warfare against enemies who used vehicles and electronics, not enemies who crawled through tall grass with nothing but cold steel and murderous determination. Field Commander Vorthas lost 2,000 soldiers, and he lost dozens of vehicles, and he lost something far more important than any of these things. He lost the certainty that the Valkyrie could not be defeated. When High Commander Zorath finally recalled him to the flagship, Vorthas stood before his superior with his carapace dull and his eyes hollow, and he delivered a report that shook the foundations of Valkyrie military doctrine. They cannot be beaten by conventional means, Vorthas said, and his voice was barely a whisper. And the only way to destroy them is orbital bombardment, and if we do that, we will violate Galactic Concord law and turn every neutral species against us. Zorath sat in silence for a long time, and he thought about the humans on that distant world with their bows and their arrows and their impossible stubborn refusal to accept defeat. How? He asked finally. And how did primitives with sticks defeat an army of 5,000? Vorthas shook his head slowly. They are not primitives, he replied. And I think perhaps they never were. And I think we made a terrible mistake when we assumed that taking away their technology would make them harmless. He looked at Zorath with something like respect in his eyes. Their ancestors spent 1,000 years perfecting the art of siege warfare, he explained. And they built castles, and they broke castles, and they developed weapons and tactics that we have never seen, because we never needed to see them, and they remember all of it, and they have been waiting for us to learn. Zorath felt the cold grip of defeat closing around his heart, and he knew that the war was lost. Humans had won without firing a single shot from any weapon that violated the treaty. They had won with sticks and strings and stones and fire, and Zorath understood at last that humanity's true weapon had never been their technology at all. High Commander Zorath stood once again in the crystalline halls of the Galactic Concord, but this time everything was different, and he felt the weight of defeat pressing down on his carapace like a mountain of shame and bitter lessons. 1 year ago he had stood in this same hall and watched Ambassador Helena Vance signed a treaty of surrender, and he had felt such satisfaction and such certainty that the humans had been broken forever. Now he understood how wrong he had been. Ambassador Vance sat across the negotiating table from him, and her face showed the lines of a year spent fighting a war that should have been impossible, and her eyes held a quiet fire that Zorath had learned to fear. She was flanked by General Marcus Chun, who had orchestrated the defense of New Helsinki, and by Dr. Priya Sharma, who had designed the weapons that had killed so many Valkyrie soldiers, and they looked at Zorath with expressions that held no hatred, but also no mercy. The representatives of the Galactic Concord sat at the head of the table, and they were beings from a dozen different species, and they watched the proceedings with great interest, because what had happened on Tethys 4 had changed everything that the galaxy thought it knew. About humanity, Zorath's military advisors had delivered an assessment that still haunted his dreams, and the assessment was simple and devastating total. Victory on Tethys 4 would require orbital bombardment because nothing else could break the human defenses, and orbital bombardment of an inhabited world would violate every law of the Galactic Concord and would turn every neutral species against the Valkyrie Dominion. The humans had outmaneuvered him completely. They had taken his victory and transformed it into defeat without ever violating the treaty that was supposed to ensure their submission. "You wish to discuss new terms," Zorath said, and his voice was flat and empty of the arrogance that had once filled an ambassador. Vance nodded, and she placed a data tablet on the table between them. "The original treaty is void," she said calmly, "because your forces attacked our civilian population in violation of the peacekeeping provisions, and the Galactic Concord has already ruled in our favor on this matter." Zorath wanted to argue, but he could not because the ruling had been unanimous and the evidence of Valkyrie atrocities had been overwhelming. "These are our terms," Vance continued, and she pushed the tablet toward him, "and you will find them considerably more favorable to humanity than the terms you imposed on us 1 year ago." Zorath read the terms, and each line felt like a blade sliding between his carapace. Plates humanity would retain full sovereignty over Tethys 4 and all other human colonies, and the Valkyrie Dominion would pay reparations for the destruction caused during the war, and both sides would agree to a mutual non-aggression pact enforced by the Galactic Concord. There was no mention of weapon restrictions. There was no mention of disarmament. There was no mention of humanity being inferior or primitive or defeated. "You expect me to sign this?" Zorath said, and his mandibles clicked with the last remnants of his pride. "I expect you to recognize reality," Vance replied, and her voice was not cruel, but it was absolutely firm. "And the reality is that your species made a mistake that we have seen many times throughout human history." She leaned forward, and her eyes locked with his 6 gleaming orbs. "You thought that our weapons made us dangerous," she said. "And you took away our guns and our missiles and our ships, and you thought that would make us helpless." General Chun spoke for the first time, and his voice carried the weight of experience and sacrifice. "Our weapons do not make us dangerous," he said quietly. "And we make our weapons dangerous, and there is a difference that your species failed to understand." Dr. Sharma nodded in agreement. "Give us rocks, and we will build catapults," she added. "And give us sticks, and we will build bows, and give us nothing at all, and we will sharpen our bones and come for you in the dark." Zorath felt a chill run through his body, because he knew that every word they spoke was true. His species had evolved beyond physical conflict millennia ago, and they had forgotten what it meant to face an enemy who would never stop fighting and who would adapt and improvise and overcome. No matter what obstacles were placed in their path, the humans had remembered. They had remembered lessons that were written in blood and fire across 10,000 years of history, and they had applied those lessons with devastating effectiveness against an enemy who thought that technology was the only measure of power. "If I refuse to sign," Zorath asked slowly, "what happens then?" Vance smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Then the war continues," she replied. "And we have been studying your other colonies, and we have been training more soldiers, and we have been building more weapons, and I promise you that what happened at New Helsinki was only the beginning." She paused and let the implications sink in. "Your soldiers are afraid of us now," she continued, "and they have learned to fear the darkness and the forests, and any place where a human might be waiting with a bow and arrow. And that fear will spread, and it will grow, and eventually your entire species will understand what it means to fight an enemy who refuses to accept defeat. Zorath looked at the treaty on the table, and he thought about his soldiers dying on a distant world, and he thought about the reports of fear and demoralization that had spread through his entire military. He thought about the future and what it would hold if this war continued, and he picked up the ceremonial stylus and he signed his name. The representatives of the Galactic Concord witnessed the signature, and the treaty became binding law. And just like that, the war was over. Ambassador Vance stood, and she gathered the documents, and she looked at Zorath one final time. "I hope your species remembers this lesson," she said, and her voice was almost gentle, "because humanity has been fighting wars since before we could write, and we have lost many times, but we have never stayed defeated." She turned to leave, and as she walked away, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. General Chun fell into step beside her, and he spoke quietly so that only she could hear. "Do you think they will try again someday?" he asked. Vance considered the question as they walked through the crystalline halls. "Maybe," she admitted, "but they will remember what happened here, and they will remember that they stripped us of everything, and we still won." She looked out through the transparent walls at the stars that spread across the infinite darkness, and she thought about all those worlds where humanity was spreading and adapting and surviving. "And if they do try again," she said softly, "they will know to fear what we might build from nothing." Chan nodded, and he thought about the colonists on Tethys 4, who had fought with bows and arrows against an interstellar empire, and he felt a fierce pride swelling in his chest. "What do we do now?" he asked. Vance smiled, and this time the expression was warm and full of hope. "We go home," she replied, "and we rebuild, and we teach our children the lessons we learned, and we make sure that humanity is never caught unprepared again." They walked together toward the transport that would carry them back to their people, and behind them, the crystalline halls of the Galactic Concord hummed with whispered conversations as representatives from a dozen species discussed what they had witnessed. The humans had won an impossible victory. They had proven that technology alone could not determine the outcome of a war, and the galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again on Tethys 4. The colonists emerged from their shelters and looked up at the sky, and they knew that the war was finally over. On the walls of New Helsinki, where so many had fought and died, someone had carved words into the stone, and those words would remain there for generations as a reminder of what humanity could accomplish when everything seemed lost. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of history. They said only this: "We refuse to surrender," and in the end that was enough.